quick point, if you're a big note taker or anything, I've actually already got these slides up and a whole bunch of relevant links and everything else at this link down here. And I'll actually put it up at the end as well. Yeah, see, you guys looking at bad usability on my slides, right? It'll be at the end, so you can grab it. So don't feel like you have to write down every single thing that's said. They're already out there, they're up. So my talk today is called Solving the Designer-Developer Divide. Just want to tell you guys a little bit about myself. My name is Marcelo Summers. I'm a UX designer, developer, do a little bit of everything at Slalom Consulting. Got to put in my quick plug. We've got a booth out there. We'd love to meet you. So be sure to stop by. They're giving away a GoPro. Is that it, Tracy? Is it a GoPro?
Yeah, it's GoPro.
So go check it out. But yeah, I've been doing this for several years. A lot of what I've done here is just self-taught. Kind of learned this myself. I was just talking with a couple people. There was actually a finance major in college, and I realized that was not for me and ran from it as fast as I could. So glad I did. And something that I'm really passionate about as a UX practitioner is the fact that how we work is just important as the quality of our work. Something I'm super interested in is the concept of, how designers work together. And I want to throw this out there before we get started. I'm glad it's a little bit smaller, intimate room. Clearly you guys are interested in solving this divide between designers and developers. Is there anything in particular that somebody can just throw out, maybe just like one or two answers of challenges that you've run into on a project? I don't need the whole project summary, but just anything in particular? What brought you guys here?
Dismantling of design.
Dismantling of design?
Yes.
Can you explain that?
You can take something, you can code it up and hand it off. It becomes a whole other thing that loosely resembles.
It never looks like the comp, right?
Right.
Got a couple little giveaways, so I appreciate you throwing that out. This is Dan Cederholm's SaaS for Designers. If you haven't checked it out, it's a very good book. Thank you. I saw another hand come up.
Yeah, related to what you just said, how to gauge how much precision and detail is required, because we find that sometimes developers fill in the voids very creatively, and so how much precision is required to ensure that the design would look like the design.
It's a really great point. What level of fidelity do we even need, right? Pixel perfect comp is never going to account for every situation. When I think about design, so often traditional design is too much like this, right? Don Draper sitting in a room coming up with a big idea, right? A designer that just kind of goes off into the little cocoon and 2 weeks later emerges with 50 comps that then the designers or the developers then have to go implement. That's how we run into that dismantling, right? It's this divide between the creative people and the implementation people, and then you get these waterfall style throw over the fence. Hey, here's all the designs. Go build this. See you guys later. I've literally seen that on projects before. It's unfortunate, and it worked really well in the print days, but it doesn't really work anymore today. But if you think about it, better organization and collaboration as a designer is going to earn you a lot of things. It's going to earn you stakeholder buy-in. If they're a part of your design process, your stakeholders are going to agree with it more if you're more open about it versus just going off into your cocoon and churning out 50 comps. They're going to feel like they had input. It's going to buy you goodwill. My gosh, the most frustrating in the world type of person in the world is that stereotypical designer that is always late, never knows what he should be working on. We've all worked with people like that simply can't organize their work and put it out, and that's frustration that people are going to have working with you. Repeat business. You may be a consultant, you may be a freelancer. Even if you're not, even if you're just an embedded designer in a product team, it's going to earn you repeat business because people are going to want to work with you. That's a good thing. And finally, it's going to gain you understanding. If you collaborate more with people and spend more time with them, they're going to understand your work. People get excited about the design process. That's something that I've seen. When you include other people, they're excited to work with designers. Don't worry, we'll address the development side as well. Another reason why I think these topics are important is responsive design, right? It used to be that you could just hand off a pixel perfect comp and somebody could go code it up. Maybe they were an awesome front-end developer, maybe the designer was doing it. But today, that's just not how design works, right? If I design a header bar for my site, that's got to adapt to a 2500 pixel wide monitor, and that's got to adapt down to a 320 pixel wide phone. And what happens in between? And I think that's the dismantling that you brought up earlier, where developers are like, hey, if the designer's not here, I just got to do something. And so often when you're on, the end of a project and everything's rushing, you miss those details. And so responsive design kind of broke this idea of the designer emerging with all of these comps. So today what we're going to talk about is 5 big ideas for how designers and developers can work better together. And I would actually say designers, developers, and stakeholders. That's a lot of what we're going to look at. The first big idea we're going to look at is the idea of design-driven scope. I think all designers want to be involved in defining what's going to be built, right? Designers generally have pretty good ideas, but the thing is, designers are equipped with a lot of awesome tools to visualize things, right? If you compare that to, say, like a business analyst who's going to be like writing user stories or a spreadsheet of things, that's not a visualization, and people understand through seeing what's going to be built. So we should use those design visualizations to define scope. And I'd like to talk about 3 non-traditional design deliverables that I've used on projects that really help get client buy-in, but then also helps inform the development team down the road, right? Kind of both sides of the design process. The first one is a screen inventory. This is going to sound so simple, you're going to be like, this is dumb. But basically what it is, it's a list of screens that are in my website, application, whatever it is that I'm building. And I can't tell you how many projects that I'm on where there's just simply not a shared understanding among the team of like what all needs to be designed, what all needs to be built. Just like, what is this application? There's just like, there's some wireframes out here, and then there's some comps that might match up to that. The developers are kind of just like building a whole bunch of screens that we don't know if the content's in the right place. So I've just found at the beginning of a project, it's incredibly effective to just sit down and list out, hey, we've got a login page, we've got our public profile, we've got our news page, we've got our admin area. I actually like to preface these with numbers, so I'll put like S1 for screen 1, S2 for screen 2. And what happens is, as you get deeper and deeper into a project and maybe somebody new rolls on, you've got this shared language for referring to screens, right? All of a sudden I can say, hey, can you shoot me the comp for S5 versus like, hey, could you send me like home screen underscore V3 final, really final this time .psd, right? All of a sudden you get like this consistent way of naming screens. And the second thing is, hey, I think the designer should just be involved in naming these screens, because what it's doing, it's getting buy-in from our stakeholders of how to refer to things. You walk into a meeting and you say, hey, today we're going to talk about the content for our news page, something that simple. Versus, I just see on projects where people come up with the most random names and they just like stick for a screen. And then somebody new comes onto the project and they're like, huh? What are you guys talking about? Like, it just doesn't make sense. So if you get in early on as a designer and get this kind of inventory and do a good job of naming that, it's going to set up your project for success 10 steps down the road. It's going to seem really trivial at the beginning, but this is long-term. The second thing that I work on is a user flow. And what it is, it's a simple visualization of how a user flows through a site. It's not quite a sitemap, right? When I think of a sitemap, I just think of, it's similar to a screen list, right? It's just a list of screens. But this is actually what a user flow looks like to me. I take that screen inventory that we just talked about and literally just lay out, hey, S1, my login screen, S2, my dashboard, and just give my client a visualization of, hey, here's how somebody actually walks through the site. I actually design these in Keynote. You can use Illustrator, OmniGraffle, Axure, whatever is your most comfortable tool of choice, but I love to print these out on a big, like 11 by 17 sheet of paper. I've had stakeholders like pin them up in their cube. I've had developers just keep it as a point of reference, so that way they kind of understand where they are in relation to other screens. But the biggest thing is that it also sets client expectation of what they're actually going to get. Early on in a project, even with wireframes, it's very expensive and time-consuming to get buy-in of like, hey, here's what all we're building and making sure we encompass everything. And so I would say in a day with your clients or with your stakeholders, it's very easy to just sit down and make sure, hey, we've actually encompassed everything. On this particular project, we had actually built out this side, which was all the public-facing stuff in the application. And then we had totally missed an entire administrative section. That one guy who was in charge of that, or his team user, was like, hey, what about these screens? How would I actually edit that? And it was like, oh, hey, cool, I can jump in there. So this is a really useful kind of tag along with that screen inventory. And then finally, the last thing is a content inventory. To me, this solves the wireframe problem. Let me throw this out there. What types of challenges have you guys had with wireframes before? And I may have another copy of SAP for web designers. Just call them out right here.
Keeping them up to date as things keep changing and tweaks are made. And keeping it in line with functional specifications as well.
Yes. Anybody else? What other types of challenges have you had?
The wireframes don't necessarily list out how something works. It just shows that it's there.
Right, like how does somebody interact with this?
Yeah, like what are the rules for this particular div or whatever.
Yeah. Has anybody ever had a client that just like latched onto a design within the wireframes and you're like, no, I wasn't trying to tell you this is how it should look? Yeah, I see a lot of heads nodding out there. That's the biggest challenge that I've ever found with wireframes, right? And if you've ever worked with wireframes, or if you've ever created wireframes, you know it is not a design document. And you're not trying to tell people how something should look, but I literally had a project where they went through 2 rounds of huge usability tests and everything, and the client had latched onto this right-hand rail for whatever reason. They wanted it to be on the right. And all of a sudden, design got a hold of this. They weren't, again, very siloed project. Design got a hold of this, and all of a sudden it wasn't in the right rail because it didn't make sense in the design. And the client freaked out. So that's a big problem with wireframes. But what are wireframes really trying to accomplish?
They're trying to communicate an idea.
An idea, okay?
Establish a blueprint.
Establish a
Blueprint,
blueprint.
right.
That's right.
When I think of them, I think of wireframes as being what is going on the page, right? It's the most simple base visualization. And to me, I've actually found a content inventory, which is this, to be an effective use or an effective deliverable for designers. What it is, again, we take that screen list. You can see how these deliverables kind of build on each other. We take that screen list, right, my home page, and then we just write a description for what that screen is, right? The first page when a user arrives at the site. Very simple. And then we actually get the client to write a goal for that screen. So what is the user, what does the client or what is the stakeholder or what is it that people are trying to accomplish on this screen? Instead of, hey, I want my logo bigger up here, you know, they're thinking, I want somebody to click through to a second article on the homepage, right? Thinking about that. And then finally, I'll actually do a list of content on the page. So on my homepage, it might be a featured article, a list of recent articles, advertisements, navigation. And I've actually gone so far as forcing clients to force rank each one of those. And what this does, if you take this, you may be the designer, you may not, but if a designer is handed a document that looks like this gives them the information that they need to design something, right? What are we trying to get somebody to accomplish on the page? What needs to be on the page and what's important? Versus having, you know, this, to me, this solves the make my logo bigger problem, right? Every client wants their logo to be bigger on their website. Instead, the client is informing the client's informing the design in the right way versus saying, hey, I want that to be bigger or I want that to be smaller. It needs to be a different color. So to me, designers are pretty happy when they get handed this. So, and another thing that's cool about this, as a designer, when you go back to your stakeholder and present this actually gives you the information to defend your design back to them, right? You're using their own words. If they say, hey, I need that button to be smaller, then you say, hey, that button is going to help drive people to better engagement. That's why I did it like that. Oh, okay, that makes sense. Cool. So those are the 3 deliverables, right? And these 3 deliverables, to me, helps inform the entire development process, right? Right now we're talking about kind of like stakeholders and designers, but this continues to go on throughout the project. So it's your screen inventory, your user flow, and your content inventory. And you can see how the 3 kind of inform each other. Big idea number 2, integrating with agile teams. This is, something that I've found many designers struggle with. If you're not familiar, Agile or the implementation of Agile that's very popular is Scrum. This is a development methodology that's basically centered around shipping functional code very often, right? And so you basically have a sprint planning event where you basically say, this is what we're going to build over the next 2 or 3 weeks. Then developers go off and actually build stuff. At the end of the 2 or 3 weeks, you have a demo of your working code, and then developers say, hey, cool. What went well, what didn't go well, we do a quick retrospective. But what about design, right? This is something that most designers are walking into. You know, most teams already have this process in place. But how does design fit into that? And a good friend of mine actually introduced this on a recent project of mine, and it totally clicked with the whole application development team. The idea was to take your development cycle, okay, cool, like that's going on here, we're shipping working code, but then you actually create a product definition team. Call that whatever you want. That might include people like your stakeholders, your product managers, your marketing team, your designers, right? Your business analysts. These are the people that are getting stories ready for development. These are the people that are defining what are we going to build. And what they do is they get these user stories. Again, if you're not familiar, a user story is basically like, as a user, I want to blank, right? It's something that a developer can pull. It has enough information for them to go build a feature. And so they're getting those stories ready and handing them off to developers. A key point is that this product definition team can be working however far in advance. But the point is, when developers get to the day they're doing the sprint planning, when they go to pull that story, those stories need to be ready. And as a team, you need to have a shared understanding of what ready means. Does it mean every screen has a COM? Does it mean an HTML template has already been created and all the developers are doing is wiring up the back end? You know, every team is going to be different. You're going to have different skill sets, but you as a team need a shared understanding of what developers need to get that, right? And then finally, developers basically pull that, they go through their development cycle, and they get stories done. And again, you need a shared understanding as a team. What does done mean? Does it mean the front end is implemented, looks pixel perfect, works at every single breakpoint, now we're going to hand it off to QA? Does it mean, hey, it's just functional and now we need to go back and skin it, clean it up, do all this stuff? It doesn't matter, but the point is that the team has to have a shared understanding of what that means, especially as a designer, right? So we get out of that destructive design where the design's falling apart, and all of a sudden the developer's like, hey, it's done, and then the designer looks at it and is like, no, it's not. So yeah, this has just been, again, a small idea, but as designers, thinking about how we embed ourselves with our teams helps. This has been something that has really worked out well on projects that I've been on. And generally, this product definition team works maybe, 2 to 4 weeks ahead. You know, because that's kind of in Agile, that's kind of you can foresee about 2 to 4 weeks ahead. So it's worked really well. Next idea is pattern-driven design. And the idea here that I want to talk about is, as a designer, to better work with your teams, we need to stop thinking about beautiful custom layouts and really start to think about standard, reusable, scalable components. Right? Responsive kills a Photoshop star. We talked a little bit about that a second ago. A pixel perfect comp means nothing because our sites, our applications can be wider, they can be narrower. It doesn't mean anything except for that one specific breakpoint that not everybody is going to have. And this came out of a world of print design, right? In print design, I know that my design is going to be looked at in this medium, at this exact size, and people got really good at Photoshop and Illustrator to deliver for this. But what happens is today, we have to think about components. Somebody named Dave Rupert actually posted a retrospective of redesigning Microsoft.com. I don't know if you guys remember, but I guess maybe like a year and a half ago, they shipped this really cool responsive design on their Microsoft.com. It didn't really propagate much deeper than like the marketing pages, but it was really nice. And what he talked about was on the site, he actually posted a screenshot of it and said, we started to think about different components within the website. So we might have a search bar up here. We might have a navigation unit right here. We have a hero image, but then you can see the hero image is actually repeated down here. Right? It's a simple pattern for implementing that multiple times. A list of links, these are the pink ones. You can see there's many lists of links. And so what happens is they start to think about, oh cool, I can reuse a list of links here, 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 here. It becomes like a reusable component. And then finally, a highlight feature, which is this yellow. And you can see that a highlight feature has an image, it has some text underneath it, but then hey, our highlight feature got really wide here, so all of a sudden the image is off to the left and there's text next to it versus under it. And so what happens here, this isn't a static Photoshop comp that I'm being handed. This is a designer that has thought through what are the components that we can kind of use as Lego building blocks to build up our site. And when you think about that, consistency is good usability. And the reason for that, there's literally an article on the Nielsen group where they say users should not have to wonder whether different words, situations, or actions mean the same thing. Right? So, I've been on projects where designers are just totally oblivious to the development cycle, and they're using a type of checkbox over here, and then a checkbox in a different place looks like this, and a checkbox in a different place looks like this. And you really have to beg the question of how are you doing this because you think it's beautiful, or are you doing this because it's actually enhancing the site and doing something more for our users? And usability tests would say that's not it. So this is backing up kind of that component-driven design. Right? Going back to the Microsoft site, every time I see a list of links, because guess what? Microsoft's whole design aesthetic, you can't really tell what's a link and what's not. But the second I click on one of these, then every time I see that pattern repeated, I know it's a link. So you only have to teach your users once versus having it be custom throughout your application. Consistency is also good development. And something that I've been thinking a lot about lately is the fact that maintainable code is flexible code. In the sense that if I'm having to do a custom implementation of a checkbox every time that it shows up, because in every context it's a little bit different, it's going to take me a lot longer to build out a cool new feature versus like, hey, we just have a checkbox, and if I need to go implement that, cool, I just drop my code in here and it's ready to go because I've already built that before. And in the long run, as you start to refactor code, as you start to make changes within the application, you have like one source of truth versus, oh shoot, we have 6 implementations of this radio button that now I need to go back and clean up. And then you start wiring up JavaScript events and all that other stuff, and it just gets crazy over time if it's too different. So, and this is kind of the meat of the talk, I think, is big idea number 4, the pattern library. This is a topic that has kind of gotten popular on the internet, I'd say, over the last 6 months or so. But to me, the pattern library is a relatively new deliverable for a responsive world, right? The idea of a pattern library or a style guide has existed for decades in print, right? A print magazine might have their style guide, or a newspaper, how they would do that, but for some reason that never quite translated to the web. It was always like this beautiful brand style guide, but nobody ever thought like, hey, how should our applications and website and everything actually function? The most popular pattern library I'd say out there is Bootstrap, right? Raise your hand if you've used a project with Bootstrap. Yeah, a lot of hands coming up. It's super popular. If you're not familiar, this was created at Twitter several years ago. The guy who built it, actually, his goal was, hey, every little Twitter application within the site itself, they have like an analytics site, an advertising site, all that stuff. We're all having to like implement our own front-end code. We need to standardize this. And so he went off and kind of created this library of components, buttons, forms, all those types of things, and made them reusable throughout the application. Funny enough, they actually never implemented Bootstrap at Twitter. And then he left Twitter, and it's actually now, he works for GitHub, and it's kind of just an open source project, so nobody necessarily owns it. But the thing about Bootstrap is, developers love it, designers hate it, right? And I'm sure most of you have seen this. Developers, they'll say things like, hey, it's quick and easy to drop into a project. I think like if you're a Microsoft developer, like the newest versions of .NET actually includes it as like the default front-end framework. I know how to use it, right? It's super easy. It's the same HTML every time. If I need pagination, I can just drop in a code snippet and it works. On the other hand, designers are saying like, hey, you're putting me into a box. Bootstrap is like too prescriptive with how things look. All sites look the same, right? I saw a quote once that was like, Bootstrap is the Times New Roman of the web, right? You know a Bootstrap site when you see it. Granted, you can customize it, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. What happens if some of these components don't necessarily work in my application? What do we do? Do we break from Bootstrap? Do we keep using it? It's kind of restrictive. So you can see there's definitely a divide here between developers and designers, and anybody who's been on a project definitely believes that. Well, Mark Otto, who was that guy that worked at Twitter, now works at GitHub, created Bootstrap, he actually gave a talk about a year ago called BYOB, Build Your Own Bootstrap. And the case that he was making in this talk was, hey, every project that you're on, I didn't build Bootstrap to power every single website on the internet. It's just something like, quick aside here, when I can do design work, but if I'm just spinning up a quick new development project, I'll just drop Bootstrap in because I don't want to think about the front end yet. I just want something that I can wire up quickly. So it works in a situation like that or in the right situations, but he's saying, hey, for a huge project, if you're a multi-million, multi-billion dollar company, build your own Bootstrap, right? Invest, a couple months, get all these components standardized and build it for your project. And what happens is you can actually have the best of both worlds. You can have developers still saying, hey, it's quick and easy to drop into my project. I know how to use it, right? Because it's the markup's all there. But at the same time, you can have your designers saying things like, I can still have a beautiful custom design, right? I can hand you comps and you go build this pattern library, and I'm not going to feel constrained as a designer. So I want to talk about 3 principles of a pattern library. They should be custom, they should be modular, and they should be reusable. Custom, So here's what's cool. Bootstrap is very prescriptive. It's prescriptive about the languages that you use, right? It used to be CSS only. Now there's like a Sass version and a less version. I'm going to throw that term out a bit if you're not familiar with Sass and less. Basically what they are, it's like a pre-compiler for CSS. So I can do all this cool stuff like variables, functions, all this, and then it like compiles it down to CSS. If you haven't looked at it, check it out. I just gave out 2 copies of my book, Dan Cederholm's Sass for Web Designers. Very good. See him showing the book over there. But so it's very prescriptive, but different projects are calling for different things. So if you're starting from the ground up, think about the technologies that you're working with. Think about the dependencies. Think about the team that you're on, and you use the right tools. If there's nobody on this project that knows Sass or less, cool. Go build it in CSS. If everybody knows less, don't go try to build it in Sass, right? Like you don't. If you're building something custom, you don't have to be prescriptive about. You can build it for that particular implementation. The next thing is that it should be modular. Everything you build inside of this pattern library should literally be like Legos, like just copy and paste code. It should just work in any context. Versus going into a world where like, hey, on this particular page, like this button should look and work like this, but on this page it's going to work differently. Like you're breaking the principles of the pattern library then. And then finally, your pattern library should be reusable. Right? You should be able to implement it easily in different projects because so often within a single company or a single client, they're going to have maybe their public website, which is its own application in and of itself. They might have like a private web portal, they might have like a client portal or something, and they might all be separate applications, separate technologies. You want to keep it flexible. Like Bootstrap, I can literally just drop a CSS file into a project and it's ready to go. Versus, and you want to continue that reusable nature of your pattern library. And a concept that I want to talk about, this is not my own, this is something that came from a guy by the name of Brad Frost. I actually linked to his article on that link I'll put up at the end. But it's this concept of atomic design. And this is the absolute best description that I've seen of what I'm talking about here. Some water. And what he talks about is your design should start with atoms, which then make up molecules, which then make up organisms, which then make up templates and pages. Let me show you what that looks like. An atom might be a label. This is what a label looks like. And an input box. This is what an input box looks like. And a button. These are all independent components that you can use wherever it wants. But combine those 3 and all of a sudden you have a pretty little search box, right? You've got your label, your search box, and your search button. And then you can take that molecule, as he calls it, and combine it with other molecules like my navigation unit and my logo into something like a header bar. Right? So you can see how we're literally it's like Lego building blocks. And then finally, my organism here can be a part of a page template. Maybe this is like an article or a section page, like my about, my blog, they all are going to have this kind of layout. You can see like the navigation then gets combined with like a hero image and a little slider thing over here that are all made up of other atoms, molecules, and organisms. And then finally, those can be combined into actual pages, which are the implementation of a template. So it's actually going to have like this image right here, some real content, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see this is kind of that Lego building block modular concept, and it's the coolest illustration that I've ever seen of it. Again, I don't take credit, it's Brad Frost. Awesome article on there about this. But again, this is the responsive design deliverable. And if you think about it, if you're building these reusable modular components that build up, you can start to think about like how does this stuff respond, right? What happens if it's super wide? What happens if I have a tiny little like iPhone, 3GS or something? Here's some examples. A lot of companies actually post theirs publicly. This is GitHub style guide. You can see like if I go on there, you can literally just do a Google search for GitHub style guide. Again, I link to it at the end. But you can see they have like a whole bunch of different elements on this particular page. This is the colors, so you can see like here's all the colors that I can use as a GitHub developer. Lonely Planet did the same thing. They publicized theirs, and you can see like on here I'm on my alerts page. Here's what a success alert looks like. Here's how I call it. They have a particular Rails app or whatever, and they built out this whole thing that I can call it like that. The next one I want to look at is MailChimp, because they actually have some really cool responsive stuff. So I've actually animated that. You can see this is an example of a navigation bar right here. It's functional, right? So I'm clicking on that. My actual code snippet is down here. I've got notes about it. And then when I talk about responsive, you can see the pattern library itself is responsive. And you can see they've thought through what happens at that particular breakpoint with my navigation. So it actually functions differently. So they built out this component. Anywhere I need a navigation bar, I can just drop in this markup, replace like my navigation system, and it's good to go at all breakpoints because somebody took the time to build that out. So it's kind of neat what MailChimp did there. But seriously though, developers love this stuff. I can't make this up. This is an actual email that I got from a developer on a project. He came on a little bit later in the project, and his first day out there, he was like, hey, I just joined and I found out about this UX site. He didn't even know what it was a Power Library. He was like, I'm crying over here loving it. Sweet. He goes on to say like, hey, I tried to get other clients to see the same value. This, coupled with the user stories, makes the process so much easier. This is a developer saying that, right? Because what's happened here, and again, I can't prescribe who's building this, but what's happened is a designer and a developer have thought out what happens to this, navigation bar at all breakpoints, so they can just go like add it in somewhere and it'll just work. Here's actually the library that he was talking about. This is what he was actually talking about. Again, just another example of what it looks like. We kind of have our navigation over on the side. We've got particular components over here. And yeah, so that's kind of a pattern library. But here's the thing. You can go out there and Google and you can find information about like why you should be using pattern libraries. I actually want to spend some time today also talking about how to actually build one of these, right? Just some cool ideas that I picked up over time. I don't want to be overly prescriptive about technologies or process or anything like that, because again, every project is going to be different, every group of people is going to be different, so these are still just kind of principles. But to me, these are the elements of a pattern library. And again, add, subtract, just use whatever is right for your project. But you have to have the basics, right? A grid. If you've implemented a grid, you have documentation about that. Typography, buttons, tables, form styles, right? These are just the basics on your project. These are kind of like the atoms or molecules that we talked about in atomic design. But then we also have components. These would be like the various like makeups of kind of your bigger like a search bar or a header bar, those types of things. Again, documentation on what's in there. I also like to document JavaScript. Hopefully you have a front-endy type of developer, but as time is going on, so much more and more of our user experience is done through animations, through just basic like jQuery slide in, slide out, and you actually need to be able to document the right ways to implement these, right? If you have, there's a big difference between running a jQuery slide down at 100 milliseconds and 2,000 milliseconds. And a developer may not have, if they're not a design-minded developer, they may just throw in a random number in there and leave it at the default. And as a designer, you may have an opinion on those things. So again, documenting the important client-facing JavaScript and those interactions is very important. And then finally, I've gone so far as actually building out full HTML page templates. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. This is what a single element within your pattern library might look like. You might have the component name, my sweet component. You might have a description about it. What are quirks about this? How should somebody actually use it? What are different variations, right? What are the things that a developer needs to know to actually implement this component? I like to put in a functional example of the component itself, right? So if you're writing the HTML, actually put the HTML in there and like have it render out. And then finally, a code snippet, and that might be HTML, that might be JavaScript. Hopefully it's not CSS, right? The idea is to keep developers out of CSS here, or only let the right developers have input with CSS. But yeah, so to me, that's just a basic element. And again, here's what one may look like. In this case, this was a checklist box. You can see I have a whole bunch of documentation in here about how to use it. As questions popped up from developers in implementing it, I might come back and actually update that documentation. An example of that component, so you can see it like in the unchecked state and the checked state. And then finally, the actual code that a developer could literally just copy that, change the report name, and it was ready to go. And they just wired up the back end, what they needed to do. And then we talk about organizing our library. You might have a table of contents, a major component area, some subcomponents, and this may make a little more sense if I show you a real example. This was another pattern library that I built out where we had colors. Well, colors was just a section. I could go there and see my colors. But then I might have buttons. So within buttons, I still have colors, sizing, a disabled state. Same thing with forms, etc. So you can see how like they're grouping into bigger buckets, like my forms, and then kind of the variation. So this kind of lets a developer easily navigate throughout. And again, You can look at other style guides out there. Heck, look at Bootstrap. They have some fantastic documentation. Just steal ideas from that. So pulling it all together, here's kind of what that particular pattern library looked like. Over here we had kind of like a navigation bar that you see kind of sticks as the developer scrolls down. They can click through it, go to different elements. Within those elements, you kind of have the documentation, the example, and I have different pages, so you can see those were more basic things. And I apologize for speaking so fast, but you can see there's an actual component in there that they can interact with. You can see the code for somebody to actually implement something. And that's just, this makes it easy for a developer where they get handed maybe a comp at a particular breakpoint. Again, I'm not saying Photoshop is bad, but they get handed a comp, they're like, oh, I've seen that element before, let me just go drop that in. And as a designer, you're thinking about like what happens at each of those levels. So I hope, those are just some ideas of like things you should include. But again, every pattern library that I've seen is very different, just depending on the needs of that particular project. Now I want to get a little bit prescriptive in case you've never done this before. A little bit, just 2 minutes about how I actually build these out, just some cool tools that I've found. I like to use a tool called Middleman. It's actually a Ruby open source project. It's a static site generator, which means if you've never used a static site generator like Jekyll or anything like that, it's actually just gives me stuff that you might have in a CMS, like templates and page partials, and then actually just renders all that out to static HTML and CSS that I can just upload to a web server somewhere. I was actually showing this to my wife last night, and she laughed because we're talking about bridging the divide between developers and designers, and I actually use a tool called Middleman to do that. I don't know, I never noticed that. I've been using this for a while. So it's cool. Again, you use a lot of Ruby in there, so if you're not familiar with Ruby, maybe this isn't as hard, but it's a pretty simple tool to get set up, and I really like it. It's got cool features like templating and partials, like I just talked about. You can use pre-compilers with it, so Sass with your CSS, you can use CoffeeScript for your JavaScript, whatever your tools of choice are. It's got live reload built into it, so as I'm making changes over here, I can hit save and it'll automatically just reload in the browser. I don't have to click over, refresh, etc. You have access to Ruby Gems, which if you've never used is just like a whole bunch of libraries that you can drop into a project. You can store data as a JSON file. I'll talk about that in a little bit. You can deploy it to GitHub Pages. Again, a lot of cool features here. Here's how I kind of organize it. This one might be less prescriptive, but I might have like my pattern library's layout. I might have a specific component page, and then I'll actually go so far as having like sub-partials for like a button, so I can just open the buttons and work on the documentation for that particular button. And then finally, it's super easy to deploy this, so I can just like run one command once I've configured it. I can just say middleman deploy, pushes it up to an FTP server somewhere, and it's up there, right? It's ready to go. So that's how I build pattern libraries. Now I want to just share some cool tricks, and we've got about 5 minutes left. Hopefully I can get through these. But again, cool tricks, you should be able to apply these on any project. I'm a big fan of using icon fonts. Icon fonts, if you've never used them, what's cool, it's exactly like a font, right? Like A, B, C, D, E, F, G, but it's just custom icons. What's cool about these, they're vector-based, so again, it works on Retina, you can scale them up really big, you can shrink them down, you're not going to get anything. It's literally as simple as just dropping in a class. And the way that I do that, I use a tool called Font Custom. Font Custom will actually just take a folder of SVGs, if you're familiar with that. That's a vector-based thing that you can export out of Illustrator. If you've ever used any like the Noun project for icons, you can download them as SVGs. Just drop them into a folder, run a command that says Font Custom Compile. You get a pretty little CSS file that has all your font stuff in there. You get a pretty little, just all the web fonts and everything that's ready to go. Next thing I want to talk about, I'm hearing noise out there, so we'll get through this quick. I like to use Git submodules for these. Again, we're getting really techy here, so I apologize if you're not a developer, but the idea is, with Git submodules, is that you have a Git repo, and then you have, if you're not familiar with Git, it's source control. You can have other Git repositories and actually run a command that's really complicated. It's basically Git submodule add, and what happens is my repository now contains these other repositories. So it can just be like a folder within my project that can be updated independently. And what that allows me to do is I create my style sheets as a Git repository, which then gets added to my pattern library, but then I can add it to multiple other projects. I could add it to the Rails project, I could add it to a .NET project, whatever it is that I need to. And so what's cool about that, again, I talked about these styles being modular. I can have a single project and reuse those style sheets throughout. So, yeah, really cool, neat little trick I picked up. In my SAS files, I'll actually do per project configuration. I will probably send you guys to the slides to see this, but the idea is like I can have URL helpers. So like every project puts the images in a different place. I can configure those in one place, and then basically in my SAS files call background image, and then say like image URL and pass in a file name, and then that just lets me, and then it would just like output the path to the images. So like my Rails project could have a different image path than my pattern library, and they'll all kind of work out. So that's pretty cool. Last thing, just 2 more points I want to talk about, and I'll let you guys go. Scaling relentlessly. Bootstrap is actually, while it's opinionated, it has some great implementations of different things that are tested. So a lot of times I'll go in there and actually just steal the code snippets, see how they're kind of doing things in CSS. There's no reason why you can't pull it out and actually reuse it. And this is where like Bootstrap SAS and Bootstrap Less become really useful, because you can see how they're building out those components. Finally, the last thing I want to talk about is a project hub. I like the idea of having a single point of reference for everybody on the project. I'm going to skip ahead. This is what a project hub looks like, and I build them custom. I use Middleman, right? The same thing that we just talked about, and I'll have, going back to our beloved screen list right here, and then we'll just have like links to all the wireframes, links to all the comps. If we need them, HTML templates on this project, we have design notes. We have links to kind of like the Axure files out there. And you can see up here, CSS, components, JavaScript. Those were actually the links to the pattern library itself. So again, I like to have this singular place. And quick story on that, this particular project, we had a copywriter roll on like 2 weeks before it launched. And she was like, oh my gosh, what do I need to write copy for? And before, what they probably would have done, the copywriter was client side, they had some designers over there, she would have had to have sat down with the creative director, gone through like the million Photoshop files, tried to find that, but instead I just pointed her to this. She had a list of all the screens, she could look at the comps and how they were being implemented, and in this case we could have even linked to like the production page for her to go see that, and she would have easily had an inventory of what all she had to write copy for. So I'm bringing this all back around to show you, using something like this, using a pattern library, these are all things that are just going to help your teams collaborate better and work together better. So again, just a quick reminder, this is something that I've just found watching other designers, seeing how stakeholders react to things that I've done. Better organization and collaboration is going to buy you stakeholder buy-in, it's going to earn you goodwill with your team, repeat business, understanding so much good stuff. I mean, it's hard to think that any of this would be bad. And just as a quick recap, being a better design citizen on teams, this is my last slide. Use design visualizations to help drive scope in what we're building, right? That sounded so simple at the beginning, but you can see how there's like this arc throughout where you're reusing those same ideas through everything. Integrating with your agile team through product definition teams. Stop thinking in custom layouts and start thinking in modular reusable components. Building a pattern library, and finally communicating through a project hub. I think we finally made it. It's 11:44:43, and I know I have to end at 11:45, so thank you. I hope this helped. I'm here for questions. And again, here's that link that I promised. So thank you.